I spent 3 months caring for my sister Magdalena, who was recovering from serious surgery in another city. During this time, I kept in touch with my daughter Cecilia via WhatsApp. She always told me everything was fine, that Nazario, my son-in-law, was taking good care of her and my granddaughters. Angela, 8, and Angelica, 5. I never suspected anything because Nazario had always been a seemingly dedicated man. He worked for a construction company and seemed to love my daughter. My name is Gloria, I'm 68 years old, and in 50 years of my life, I never thought I'd experience what I'm about to tell you about today. I decided to return a week earlier than planned because I missed my granddaughters a lot and wanted to surprise them. I took the early morning bus and arrived in the capital around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. I vividly remember the smell of tortillas wafting from a taco stand around the corner from Cecilia's house when I got out of the taxi. My heart was filled with joy at the thought of seeing my granddaughters' little faces running up to hug me. I rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. I used my spare key, the one I always kept for emergencies, and entered the silent house. What I found shocked me deeply. The house was in terrible disarray. Dirty dishes had been piled up in the sink for days, clothes strewn across the living room, toys everywhere. It seemed like no one had cleaned in weeks. I called the girls Cecilia, but only silence answered me. It was then that I saw a note taped to the refrigerator in the handwriting of Cecilia's elderly neighbor, Donna Juana. Gloria, if you come back, your daughter is in the hospital at this address. The girls are with me. Come see me urgently. My legs trembled. My blood pressure shot up, and for a moment I thought I'd faint right there in my daughter's kitchen. I ran to Donna Juana's house, where she tearfully told me that Cecilia had fainted 3 days earlier while playing with the girls in the yard. Nazario wasn't home as usual, and she was the one who called the ambulance and took my daughter to the hospital. From then on, the girls were under his care because Nazario rarely showed up, always with work and important meetings as excuses. My world crumbled at that moment, and I knew something very serious was happening to my family. I ran to the hospital like a madwoman, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of my chest. When I arrived at room 247, I saw my daughter Cecilia lying on that white bed, pale as a ghost, hooked up to several machines that emitted constant sounds. She was conscious, but so weak that she could barely lift her head. When she saw me, she began to cry silently, and I realized she had suffered much more than she imagined. Dr. Salazar, a middle-aged man with a kind expression, explained to me that Cecilia suffered from severe anemia and malnutrition, as well as clear signs of extreme stress and deep depression. I stood beside my daughter, holding her cold, thin hand, trying to understand how she had reached this deplorable state. Cecilia told me through tears and pauses to catch her breath that Nazario had changed completely in recent months. He left home very early and returned at dawn, always irritable and distant. He stopped giving her money for household purchases. He said the company was going through difficulties, but at the same time he would arrive with new clothes and expensive perfume. My daughter had lost 15 kilograms because she often went without food. He gave all the food to the girls, and she was left with only tea and cookies. What outraged me most was learning that Nazario hadn't been to the hospital even once since Cecilia was admitted. The nurses told me he called only once. He said he was at a very important work meeting and would go as soon as he could. While my daughter was fighting for her life in that hospital bed, he was supposedly working. But something deep in my heart told me that story didn't add up. Nazario had never traveled for work before. He'd always worked here in the capital, and that excuse sounded too strange and convenient. I decided to call him immediately. When he answered, I could hear background music and conversations. He was clearly in a restaurant or bar. He told me he was in a very important business meeting and couldn't talk at the moment. When I asked him about Cecilia, he coldly responded that she was in the hospital but fine, as if talking about a stranger. It was at that moment that all the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in my mind, and I knew I had to uncover the truth about what Nazario was really doing while my daughter wasted away alone. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed at the hospital until the nurses forced me to go home to rest, but my mind kept racing. I knew I had to find out what Nazario was doing, so I decided to investigate on my own. I remembered that he always left his bank accounts open on the home computer, and since I had added my credit card as an additional account for family emergencies, I had access to the statements. What I discovered made me. I felt a rage I'd never experienced in my entire life. In the last 3 months, exactly the time I was away taking care of my sister, Nazario had spent more than 40,000 pesos on my card. Expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, jewelry at a famous store, men's and women's clothing at elegant boutiques, spas, beauty salons, and even a weekend trip to Cancun. Every expense made my stomach churn with nausea, because while he was feasting in sophisticated places, my daughter and granddaughters were struggling at home, since he himself wouldn't let Cecilia work, telling her place was at home. Taking care of my youngest granddaughter while the eldest went to school. The next day I decided to follow Nazario to test my suspicions. I asked Dona Juana to stay with the girls once more and called a taxi to take me to the company where I supposedly worked. I was surprised to discover that Nazario had been fired just like that after 2 months for excessive absences and inappropriate behavior. The human resources manager confirmed that he was constantly absent. He'd come home drunk and argue with his colleagues. I felt my blood boil as I realized he'd been lying to us all this time. I followed Nazario from the morning and discovered he was living in a rented house with a young, blonde woman covered in expensive jewelry. I saw him kiss that woman dressed in the luxurious clothes he had bought with my money. I saw them leave a fancy restaurant, living like kings while my daughter slowly died of starvation and neglect in the hospital. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't allow him to continue squeezing our family to live a life of lies and betrayals alongside his mistress. I returned home with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I had to DHE Bank and canceled my additional card, which was in Nazario's name. I blocked all access to my accounts and even managed to dispute so. I immediately called several charges from the past few days as unauthorized transactions. The operator told me the refund would take a few days, but that the card would be blocked immediately. I also removed Nazario as the beneficiary on all my accounts and insurance policies, something I had done years ago when I still believed he was a good husband for my daughter. I then called a lawyer familiar to the family, Mr. Campos, who had handled the estate paperwork when my late husband passed away. I explained the entire situation to him, and he advised me on how to proceed legally. Since the house where Cecilia lived was in my name, a precaution I took when I helped them get married, I had every right to evict Nazario immediately. Mr. Campos prepared all the necessary documents and advised me to gather all the evidence of the fraudulent expenses and family abandonment. I returned to the hospital to be with Cecilia and tell her everything I had discovered. My daughter wasn't surprised. She said she'd suspected it for weeks, but was too weak and scared to confront Nazario. She confessed to me that in recent months he had become aggressive. He would yell at her for any reason. He threatened to take the girls away if she didn't stop pestering him with questions about money and his strange schedule, and yet he wouldn't let her file for divorce. My daughter was living a silent nightmare, afraid to talk to me because she didn't want to worry me while I was babysitting Aunt Magdalena. Around 6 p.m., my phone rang. He was a Nazi, completely desperate and furious. Apparently, he had tried to pay a bar bill and his card was rejected. He tried to withdraw money from the ATM and discovered he no longer had access to anything. His voice was filled with rage when he called me, demanding an explanation and saying I had no right to do that. It was at that moment that I realized how accustomed he was to living at our expense and how he would react when faced with the real consequences of his actions. Nazario stormed into the hospital, shouting through the halls and demanding to speak to me. The security guard almost had to intervene because he was completely out of his mind, swearing and causing a scene in front of other patients and visitors. When he finally arrived at Cecilia's room, I was already prepared for that moment. I had called Mr. Campos, who was at my side with all the legal documents, and I also asked 2 nurses to remain as witnesses to what was about to happen. Nazario accused me of ruining his life. He said I was a nosy old woman and that he worked hard to support the family. When I showed him the photos I'd taken of him with his mistress, the bank statements with all the excessive expenses, and the termination letter from the company, he was silent for a few seconds. Then he exploded into an even bigger rage, saying I had the right to live my life, and that Cecilia was a boring, dull woman who couldn't appreciate a man like him. At that moment, I saw my daughter regain her dignity, even though she was physically weakened. Nazario tried to approach the bed, but Attorney Campos prevented him from doing so by handing him the official documents that he would be sued for abandonment of the family and fraudulent use of a credit card. Nazario tore up the papers, threw them on the floor, and stormed out of the hospital, shouting that he would take revenge on us all. But I didn't feel fear, only relief. In the following days, Cecilia began to miraculously recover thanks to proper nutrition, medication paid for by my health insurance, and, above all, the support of her family. She began to smile again. Today, 7 months later, my daughter works in a children's clothing store. The girls attend an excellent public school, and Nazario never showed up again, not even to sign the divorce papers. Sometimes I find out he's still with the same woman, but now he's living in her house on favor because he lost everything when I cut off his support. I learned that sometimes we must be strong and make difficult decisions to protect those we love, even if it means confronting people we thought we knew. I learned that sometimes we must be strong and make difficult decisions to protect those we love, even if it means confronting people we thought we knew. That day, I chose silence over anger, but inside my heart, a storm was raging. I realized trust can be fragile, and betrayal cuts deeper than any wound. Yet, for the sake of my family, I stood tall. Love gave me courage, and courage gave me strength to walk away from pain, to rebuild, and to protect what truly mattered.